It has been documented that a well-maintained cable pressure system prevents wet cables. But how does it really work, and what pressure do you really need to keep the cables dry? To begin with, there are two forces at work in every cable leak. One is the air pressure escaping the hole in the cable, and the second is the water trying to get in. If the air pressure inside the cable is higher than the water pressure outside, then bubbles will escape and your cable stays dry. If the water pressure outside is higher than the air pressure inside, well then you know what happens. We all know that our air pressure comes from our compressor dryers, but where does the water pressure come from? If you ever dive down in a swimming pool, especially with a bad head cold, you will start feeling pressure on your ears. That's water pressure. Once you get deeper than 6 feet or so, your ears will be screaming. And that's because the 6 feet of water stacked on top of your head exerts great pressure trying to burst through your eardrums. The same is true for our cable pressurization system. The more water on top of the cable, the more water pressure trying to force its way in at the leak. So what kind of cable pressure is needed to keep the water out? It has been calculated that it takes a half pound of cable pressure to keep every foot of water above the cable out. At that pressure level, the air escaping the cable will be just enough to stop the water trying to get in. For example, if your manhole is full of water and your cable is mounted 6 feet below the surface, you need at least 3 pounds of cable pressure to keep the water out. There are 3 different environments that cables are placed, and they each have their own air pressure standards. These 3 locations are known as underground, buried, and aerial. Pressure TDs installed in each of these locations will have a different 2-letter type designation on PressureWeb. Underground pressure transducers, known as UP in PressureWeb, have a minimum air pressure requirement standard of 5 psi. This is because the average manhole is 10 feet deep, and so the typical underground cable is not deeper than 10 feet below the surface. The buried cable environment has buried pressure transducers, known as BP in PressureWeb. These have a minimum air pressure requirement standard of 3 psi. The typical buried cable is much closer to the surface than an underground cable, so it has much less potential for water standing on top of it. Aerial cables have aerial pressure transducers, known by the AP transducer type in PressureWeb. All that is needed in aerial cables is positive pressure, though the standard is typically 2 psi. 2 psi is enough to keep 4 feet of water out of your aerial cables. If you have 4 feet of water standing on top of your aerial cables, then you have bigger problems than just wet cables, like building an ark. What must be understood is that these air pressure standards are general guidelines and may not be enough for your specific situation. Your manholes may be deeper than 10 feet, in which case the standard goes out the window. A cable leak in the underground with 18 feet of water standing on top of it will go wet even if it has the standard 5 psi of air pressure. There is another pressure standard that is many times overlooked, and that is the delivery pressure to the cables. It is hard to have 5 psi in the underground if you're only feeding the cables with 3 psi. Air feeds in the central office have a different standard than out in the field. In the central office, pipe panel pressure, or source pressure, is known by the designation SP in Pressure Map. Distribution panel pressure is known by the designation DP in Pressure Map. All pipe alarm and distribution panels should be set at 10 psi. Out in the field, all air pipes are required to have a pressure transducer at the endpoint, known as the EP pressure. All air pipes should have a minimum pressure of 7.5 psi. If your end pipe pressure is below 5 psi, you have no chance of keeping 5 psi of pressure on your cables. Now that we know the pressure standards and designations, it's easy to look through our PressureWeb system and see what reading is good and what is bad. If you have any questions, please visit airtalk.com or call our tech support line. Operators are standing by.